In this lecture, we discuss the conquests of Alexander the Great and Alexander's impact on the Jews and later Jewish tradition. We end by exploring possible parallels between later traditions surrounding Alexander and Jesus. Our story starts in the 4th century BC, when Alexander's father, Philip II of Macedon, united all of Greece under his rule. After Philip II was assassinated in 336 BC, Alexander, at the age of 18, succeeded him to the throne and became king of Macedonia and ruler of Greece. 2 years later, in 334 BC, Alexander launched an invasion of the Persian Empire. Remember that at this point, the Persian Empire bordered on Greece, going right up to the area of Macedonia. Alexander crossed the Hellespont with his Macedonian troops and landed on Persian soil near ancient Troy. Over the course of the next few years, Alexander eventually fought and won 3 major battles against the Persian king Darius III. After the last battle, in 331 BC, Darius's own men killed him, and that cleared the way for Alexander to become ruler of all of the lands of Persia. However, this was not the end of Alexander's conquests. He continued to push eastwards with his troops into lands that had not been subject previously to the Persians, including Bactria and Sogdiana, modern Afghanistan, and across the Indus River Valley into India. Once Alexander had conquered all of these lands, he never returned to his native Greece. Instead, he set up court in Babylon, where he died in the year 323 BC. Now, during the course of Alexander's conquests and his march through the lands of the Persian Empire, he came through Palestine, through the area of the land of Israel. This happened in the year 332 BC, when Alexander detoured south in order to reach Egypt. While in Egypt, Alexander did a couple of very important things that will be important for his later tradition. Number 1, he founded a new city on the coast, which he named after himself. He called it Alexandria. Number 2, he visited an oracular shrine dedicated to the god Zeus Ammon in an oasis called Siwa, which was out in the desert. And the importance of this visit is that when Alexander approached the oracular shrine, he was greeted by the local priests as if he was a god. Now, in order to reach Egypt, Alexander passed through Palestine because, of course, he was coming from the north. And as he passed through Palestine then, the country, including the Jews, came under Alexander's rule. And the Jews, or Judeans, submitted peacefully to Alexander as he marched through. Greek historians do not mention Jerusalem or the Jews in connection with Alexander's conquests, which is actually not surprising because, of course, Judea was the home of an obscure people, an insignificant tribe, the Jews, and in fact, no contemporary Jewish sources refer to Alexander either. In other words, we do not have any ancient Greek sources or contemporary Jewish sources that talk about Alexander the Great's conquests of Judea. But after Alexander died, Jewish sources began to develop about a supposed visit by Alexander to Judea and Jerusalem, and we're going to talk about these. Now, the silence of contemporary sources about a visit by Alexander to Jerusalem or Judea doesn't mean that Alexander did not visit Jerusalem or Judea, but probably he did not, in fact. And the reason is that he wouldn't have any reason to. In order to go from north, from the area of Syria, down to Egypt, Alexander would have gone along the coast, and our sources, in fact, indicate that that is the road that he took, the coastal road always being the easiest way to go from north to south through the country. There's no reason that Alexander would have taken the hilly, mountainous roads in the interior of the country, which would have gone by way of Judea and Jerusalem. So, in fact, it's pretty likely that Alexander never went through Jerusalem and Judea as he went to Egypt in 332 BC. So Alexander passes through the country, through Palestine in 332 BC on his way to Egypt, and then after visiting Egypt, continues on his conquests through the rest of the Persian Empire. What happened when Alexander passed through in 332 is that he had to now make arrangements to administer the country, to govern the country. And it's interesting that Alexander chose to accept and left intact the religious and political privileges that the Jews had enjoyed under the Persians. So basically what he did is he left the governing system intact and replaced the Persian officials and administrators with his own men. Now, in the centuries after the death of Alexander, when Alexander became the Great, the Jews sought to associate themselves with Alexander and his greatness. And it's in these centuries that stories and legends began to circulate among the Jews about a visit by Alexander to Jerusalem and Judea. And other traditions began to develop and circulate as well. Perhaps the best known of these is Daniel's vision of the ram and the he-goat, which is in the book of Daniel, chapter 8, verses 1 through 27. And here is what this passage, the relevant part of this passage, reads. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, of the same nature as that which had previously appeared to me. I raised my eyes and looked, and lo, standing in front of the stream, there was a ram with 2 horns. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward. None of the beasts could stand before him, nor could anyone rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and accomplished great exploits. As I was considering the matter, lo, a he-goat from the west advanced over the whole face of the earth, and without touching the earth, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. And he smote the ram and broke his 2 horns, and as the ram had no power to stand before him, he cast him down to the ground and trampled upon him, there being none to rescue the ram from his power. Behold, I, Gabriel, am making known to you what shall be at the end of the time of wrath, for the vision relates to the appointed end of all. The ram which you saw with the 2 horns is the king of Media and Persia. The he-goat is the king of Greece. So in this passage, Daniel is shown a vision, which involves this ram and a he-goat. And the passage ends by explicitly identifying the ram, which has 2 horns, with the king of Media and Persia, hence the 2 horns. And the he-goat coming from the west is Alexander the Great, who conquers the ram, who conquers the Persian Empire. And this is a vision which relates to the coming end of days, something that we'll be talking about more. So notice how this story embeds Alexander in Jewish expectations about the end of days. Now, we have another famous story involving the Jews and Alexander. This is a story which is preserved by the ancient Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. Josephus tells this story, which is highly legendary. And according to the story, Alexander was greeted by the high priest, the Jewish high priest Jaddua, who presented Alexander with the Jewish community's capitulation. And then Alexander offered a sacrifice in the Jerusalem temple. And here is what the relevant part of this passage says. Now Alexander, when he had taken Gaza, made haste to go up to Jerusalem. Parenthetically, notice Alexander's on the coast. He's at Gaza, right, which is on the way to Egypt. So that's exactly where you would expect him. But according to this legend, Alexander now sort of takes a detour to go to Jerusalem. Okay, moving on with the story. Jaddua, the high priest, when he heard that, was in agony and terror, not knowing how he could meet the Macedonians. When he understood that Alexander was not far from the city, he went out in procession with the priests and the multitude of the citizens. The procession was venerable, and the manner of it different from other nations. For Alexander, when he saw the multitude at a distance in white garments, while the priests stood clothed with fine linen, and the high priest in purple and scarlet clothing, with the mitre on his head, with the golden plate on which the name of God was engraved, he approached by himself and bowed down before the name of God, and first saluted the high priest. Now, the point of this story is pretty obvious, to show that not only did Alexander detour in order to meet with the Jews and go to Jerusalem, but that when he saw the appearance of the high priest and the other priests and the name of God, he was so awed that he bowed down. In other words, Alexander, according to this legend, recognized the greatness of the God of Israel. So these are the sorts of stories and legends that began to circulate about Alexander and his conquests after the time of Alexander among the Jews. What happens with the Samaritans under Alexander is an interesting contrast with the case of the Jews. The Jews, of course, submitted peacefully to Alexander, but this was not what happened with the Samaritans. Now, at first, the Samaritan governor, Sanballat III, in fact, supported Alexander, something that we have talked about, and was even given permission by Alexander to build the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. So basically, the governor, the Persian governor of the district of Samaria, the Medina of Samaria, defected over to Alexander's side very early on, and in exchange was given permission by Alexander to build a Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. However, after Sanballat III died, the Samaritans, for reasons that are not clear, rebelled against Alexander and burned alive his governor. In punishment, Alexander destroyed the city of Samaria, which of course had been the capital city of this district going all the way back to the time of the biblical kingdom of Israel, and banished the Samaritans from the city. And the Samaritans now went to live at Shechem, the biblical city of Shechem, or modern Nablus, at the foot of Mount Gerizim, at the foot of their sacred mountain. And from this point on, the district of Samaria had two major urban, but very different, urban centers in it located very close to each other. Number one, the Samaritan or Yahwistic population that was concentrated in the area of Mount Gerizim and Shechem. And number two, the city of Samaria, which now became a Greek city because Alexander settled there Macedonian military veterans. And these two urban centers, Shechem or Nablus and the city of Samaria, are located only about 5 miles apart from each other. So Alexander died at a young age in 323 BC, and his death plunged his empire into a civil war that lasted for the next 20 years. And during the course of this long period of civil war, Alexander's mother, his 3 wives, and his offspring were all killed. And eventually, Alexander's empire was divided up among various generals. For our purposes, the 2 most important generals are Seleucus. Seleucus got most of Asia Minor, Syria, and Mesopotamia, a very large chunk of land. And this kingdom then, which we know is the Seleucid kingdom, was ruled by Seleucus's successors, who are called the Seleucids. The other general who's important for us is Ptolemy, who got Egypt. And his kingdom, the Ptolemaic kingdom, was ruled by Ptolemy's successors, who were called the Ptolemies. And what's important to note here is that Palestine, therefore, was located right smack dab between the Seleucids to the north and the Ptolemies to the south, and therefore was a bone of contention between them, sort of going back and forth. During most of the 3rd century BC, Palestine was under the rule of the Ptolemies, and during most of the 2nd century BC, Palestine was under the rule of the Seleucids. Now, one of the challenges that Alexander's successors faced was legitimizing themselves as the heirs of Alexander in the eyes of their populations. And the problem here is that none of Alexander's successors, none of these generals, were actually related to Alexander. And in antiquity, the law of succession was usually dynastic. So you succeeded somebody who was a member of your family. But none of Alexander's successors were related to Alexander, and therefore they had to find various ways to legitimize themselves in the eyes of their populations. And they did this in various and very interesting ways. One of the ways that Alexander's successors legitimized themselves in the eyes of their populations was by having themselves portrayed as physically resembling Alexander. So if you look at their portraits, whether they're in statues or whether they're on coins, for example, you see that often they are depicted as having many of the same characteristics and features as Alexander, so they somewhat resemble Alexander. Of course, none of them would have actually resembled Alexander because they weren't related to Alexander by blood. But remember that in antiquity, there really was no mass immediate communication as there is today. And usually most people never saw the king in real life. So the only way that they knew what the king looked like would be from an occasional statue that was set up, or perhaps those little coins that circulated and had the portrait of the king on them. And so if they saw these images of the king and the king looked like Alexander, then the king actually didn't need to say that he was related to Alexander. People would have drawn their own conclusions. So this was one device for legitimizing themselves, these kings legitimizing themselves as Alexander's successors. Another way that these generals established their legitimacy as Alexander's successors was to imitate what Alexander had done. So they actually did like Alexander. And specifically what they did was to found Greek cities. Just as Alexander had established a city on the coast of Egypt and named it after himself Alexandria, so his successors founded new cities around their kingdoms, which they named after themselves. And these were not just any cities, they were specifically Greek cities, what's called a polis. These cities were Greek in that they had Greek-style institutions, so, for example, theaters for the performance of Greek plays, temples dedicated to Greek gods, council houses for Greek-style council meetings, gymnasia so that the youth could be educated in the Greek manner. And the reason that they did this was not just to imitate Alexander, but because these successors of Alexander used Greek culture as a means of unifying the diverse populations under their rule. And these populations then who lived in these cities also grew loyal to the king because they benefited from living in a city that had all of these wonderful institutions. So this was a very effective tool, and it is what we call a process of Hellenization, the making of these empires or kingdoms as Greek, the spreading of Hellenistic culture or Greek culture throughout the realms ruled by Alexander's successors. Now, what I would like to do is to consider the possible parallels in later traditions about Alexander the Great and Jesus Christ. These parallels have been explored by a scholar named Ori Amitai in a book called From Alexander to Jesus that was published in 2010. And in this book, Amitai explores the ways in which Alexander might have served as a model for the mythical Jesus. And notice the very important qualification here. What Amitai is talking about is not the historical Jesus, but the mythical Jesus, by which he means the traditions that developed about Jesus after his death. Amitai's main points can be sort of summarized as follows. As heir to the royal Argead family, Alexander was conceived as a direct descendant of the Greek hero Heracles or Hercules. And this was very common, by the way, in the Greek and Roman world, that royal families would trace their ancestry back to a hero or a god. And in this case, Alexander's family traced its ancestry back to the Greek hero Heracles or Hercules. And Alexander, therefore, is often shown in ancient depictions with the attributes characteristic of Heracles. For example, sometimes he's shown as wearing the lion's mane cape that you often see Heracles wearing. Amitai argues that Alexander lived his entire life in emulation, competition, and self-identification with Heracles. This established a basis for Alexander's transformation from human to divine, which was not a feature of the Greek world before then. Now, this is, before we go on, an important point, because in the Greek world, before the time of Alexander, Greek rulers were not worshipped or identified as gods, as deities. This was a characteristic of the ancient Near East, if you think, for example, of the Egyptian pharaohs. But in the Greek world, until the time of Alexander, rulers were always very human, and they were treated as very human. So one of the new features that we see introduced into the Greek world, beginning with the time of Alexander, is this idea that the ruler becomes a god, is worshipped as a god. This is why, by the way, this tradition about the oasis at Siwa, where the priests of the local oracular shrine of Zeus Ammon come out and greet Alexander as if he's a god. That's the significance of that tradition. So Amitai here is pointing out the importance of the claim that Alexander's family traced their lineage back to Heracles, the importance of this in Alexander's perceived deification, that is, that Alexander becomes a god. So he was descended already from gods, and therefore he himself becomes worshipped as a god, this being new in Greek culture. In addition, Amitai points out, Alexander's legacy adopted a number of motifs from the mythology of Heracles. So not only do we have this sort of divine ancestry going back to Heracles, but there are other aspects of the mythology of Heracles that become features of traditions surrounding Alexander, including divine sonship, double paternity, a world mission on behalf of humanity, and divinization. Now, interestingly, these motifs are also a part of the myth of Jesus, not the historical Jesus, but the myths that develop about Jesus. Alexander is a key figure here because Alexander already was a key figure in Jewish eschatological thought. By eschatological thought, I mean traditions or expectations among Jews about what was going to happen at the end of days. In Jewish eschatological thought, Alexander is situated at the beginning of a new era, which is perceived as the last stage of history before the end of days, the eschaton. So, in other words, Alexander in Jewish eschatological thought becomes connected with expectations about the end of days, and specifically is thought as being placed in a very key position in an era right before the end of days is about to begin. So in other words, in Second Temple period and Rabbinic period Judaism, Alexander was understood as a necessary step on the road to the advent of the Messiah. Now, we have already seen that Alexander plays a key role in the most influential piece of apocalyptic literature produced by Second Temple period Judaism, the Book of Daniel. According to this book, Daniel stands in the royal court of 3 successive kingdoms: Babylon, which is symbolized by gold, Media by silver, and Persia by bronze. And he looks into the future where he sees the progress of human history in a series of distinct visions presented as a succession of kingdoms. The last kingdom, the 4th kingdom, is Macedonia, symbolized by iron. And this kingdom, significantly, is to be followed by God's kingdom. Thus, the Hellenistic age, inaugurated by Alexander, is perceived as the last stage in history before the dawn of God's kingdom. The perception of Alexander as the instigator of the last stage in history before the Messianic era, based on his role in the Book of Daniel, was to become a staple in Jewish eschatology, in Jewish traditions about the end of days. Josephus' story about Alexander and the high priest, which we looked at, legitimizes Alexander and his campaign by making them part of God's plan as foretold in Daniel. So we can see the influence of the Book of Daniel on later Jewish writers and later Jewish traditions. Now, one of the questions that Amitai asks is, how was it possible for monotheistic mythology to give birth to a son of God? So we would not expect monotheists like the Jews, this is what Amitai argues, to originate a belief in a son of God. Where does this come from? And he proposes, actually, that Alexander is the key figure here. Specifically, Amitai proposes that Alexander's historical role as the paragon of divinization, combined with his positive reception in wide circles within the Jewish world, and his penultimate position in contemporary eschatology that he's placed right before the beginning of the end of days, helped prepare the way for the acceptance by Jews of the divine sonship principle, this idea that the Son becomes divine. Amitai notes also the parallels between Heracles and Jesus: divine sonship, double paternity, transition from the human to the divine, but only Alexander, not Heracles, only Alexander was a flesh and blood person who broke the barrier between humanity and the divine. Now, Alexander died at the age of 33. And another well-known parallel between Alexander and Jesus is that it seems that Jesus died also at the age of 33, at least if we go according to the gospel accounts. According to Luke chapter 3, verse 23, quote, "Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his work," end of quote. Which means that Jesus died at the age of 33 based on John's reference to Jesus celebrating 3 Passovers during his ministry. Other parallels between Alexander and Jesus, as we have seen, include divine sonship, dual paternity, virgin birth, world rule, mission of the benefit of humankind, death at a young age before the mission is complete, and divinization. The myth of Jesus signifies the acceptance of Alexander's precedent of divinization by believers in a monotheistic faith. So Amitai concludes that Alexander was a bridge between the worlds of monotheism and polytheism. And I quote, "Alexander and Jesus were close neighbors in the boiling matrix of gods, heroes, and demons, which characterized the religious life of later antiquity. End of quote. And so we conclude with possible parallels between later traditions surrounding Alexander the Great in Jewish eschatological thought and traditions and the mythology of Jesus and his life.